A ship completes its top-secret mission, delivering the core of the world's first atomic bomb, then vanishes unescorted and untracked into hostile waters. The commander, Captain Charles McVay, is haunted forever by a tragedy the nation was not allowed to discuss, and then blamed for it in silence. How does duty turn into lifelong accusation? And why was secrecy more dangerous than any enemy? To discover the true weight behind the captain's burden, we have to start with the sealed orders that made the Indianapolis invisible. Orders arrived at Mare Island in July 1945, each document stamped with the highest level of classification the Navy could issue. Captain Charles McVay, standing in the captain's quarters, broke the seal on a set of directives that offered only the barest details. Proceed at once. Maximum speed. Deliver cargo to Tinian. The specifics of the shipment were hidden even from his closest officers. Only a handful of men, Army couriers in plain uniforms, boarded with their own packets of paperwork. Their presence was explained as routine. In truth, they were Manhattan Project officials, responsible for guarding a wooden crate and a steel canister, each locked and chained, their transfer tracked by signatures on a custody manifest. The contents, never spoken aloud, were the core and trigger for a new kind of weapon. The ship's cargo hold became a restricted zone. Navy and Army couriers kept watch, their orders authorizing them to remain with the cases at all times. At every handoff from pier to deck, from deck to secured compartment, signatures were required, and the papers changed hands under the eyes of both services. The manifest recorded the transfer, listing only serial numbers and coded descriptions. Even the loading crew was kept at arm's length, told nothing beyond what was needed to move the containers below. McVay's own movement orders came in a sealed envelope to be opened only after clearing the Golden Gate. The instructions inside gave him no room for questions. He was to proceed without delay, avoid all unnecessary communication, and maintain radio silence except in case of absolute emergency. The ship's route, speed, and schedule were dictated by the urgency of the mission, but not a word explained why. Officers and crew speculated, but the chain of secrecy held. Only the captain, the couriers, and a handful of senior command in Washington and the Pacific knew what the Indianapolis truly carried. By the time the ship slipped into open water, the crew sensed the unusual tension. Extra guards appeared on the main deck. Access to the hold was forbidden. The Army officers kept to themselves, always near the locked compartment, their orders and custody forms tucked inside briefcases. The secrecy was total. The men of the Indianapolis sailed into the Pacific with no idea that their ship had just become the most important and most invisible vessel in the war. Engines roared below decks as the Indianapolis surged into the Pacific, holding a pace few ships could match. The order was clear: maintain 29 knots, the highest sustained speed the cruiser's machinery could handle. For much of the crew, the days blurred into a cycle of sweat and vibration. Metal bulkheads trembled with every revolution of the propeller shafts. In engineering, sailors monitored gauges and oil levels around the clock, pushing turbines designed for battle, not for a marathon across thousands of miles. Speed. From San Francisco to Pearl Harbor, then out again to Eniwetok, and on to Tinian, the ship covered more than 5,000 miles in just over 10 days. Each day, the deck logs recorded the relentless pace. The ship's wake stretched behind her, a white scar slicing through the blue. The urgency was never explained, but no one needed to ask. Every routine was trimmed, every delay avoided. The Indianapolis was exempt from the usual movement reporting, no position updates, no check-ins with command. an exception reserved for only the most sensitive missions. Radio silence was absolute, broken only for emergency signals or essential navigation. Silence. The strain on men and machinery was everywhere. Boilers ran hot, their pressure flirting with red lines. Oilers worked non-stop, feeding fuel into the hungry engines. Below decks the air was thick with heat and the smell of lubricants. Sleep came in snatches, interrupted by the constant hum and the knowledge that any breakdown could mean disaster. Deck officers kept a constant watch for signs of mechanical trouble, but the ship held together. Strain. The crew's endurance matched the ship's. Meals were quick, conversations brief. Even small talk faded as the days wore on. Some men passed the time with cards or letters, but most simply waited for the next watch. The couriers from the army kept to their routines, always near the locked compartment. Each hour at this pace brought the Indianapolis closer to Tinian and farther from any help if something went wrong. Endurance. By the time the island finally appeared on the horizon, the ship and her crew were spent. The log for the final approach recorded the same relentless speed. The Indianapolis had set a record for the fastest transit from the United States West Coast to Tinian, but the price was exhaustion, frayed nerves, and engines in need of rest. The mission was not just a sprint, it was a test of how far a ship and her crew could be pushed, in the name of secrecy and speed. Record. The Indianapolis left Tinian unescorted, her mission completed, but her vulnerability now exposed. The orders for her return offered no extra protection, no destroyer to screen for submarines, no submarine alert, and no requirement to report her position along the way. The route cut straight across the Philippine Sea, a stretch of water where enemy submarines had already claimed American ships in recent weeks. Official routing charts on the bridge showed the ship's intended path, a direct line from Guam to Leyte, with no deviations for safety. Patrol intelligence, if it existed, never reached McVay or his officers. Instead, the ship was told to rely on speed alone. The Navy's movement reporting system, called MOVREP, had been suspended for the Indianapolis. No one in command expected a status update or tracked her progress. Once the ship left Guam, she vanished from the Navy's operational board, her position and arrival time a matter of guesswork, not oversight. On the bridge, McVay studied the charts and weighed his limited options. He asked about submarine threats before departing, but the replies from command were non-committal. Intelligence about increased Japanese submarine activity, including the recent sinking of the USS Underhill, was not shared with him. The last visual contact came on July 29th, when a passing LST exchanged signals with the Indianapolis. After that, the cruiser sailed alone, her presence in the vast Pacific, marked only by a thin pencil line on a classified chart. There was no expectation that anyone would be watching for the ship's safe arrival. No tracking officer was assigned to note her progress. If trouble came, there would be no immediate help. No search party. No alert sounded. The Indianapolis pressed on into open water, her crew unaware that their isolation was not just a matter of distance, but of design. The silence around their movements was as absolute as the darkness gathering on the horizon. Questions began quietly on the bridge, as the Indianapolis slipped further from land. Captain Charles McVay and his officers reviewed the charts, noting the direct route drawn across the Philippine Sea. The area was known for submarine attacks, but no special precautions were ordered. McVay sent a query to higher command, requesting updated intelligence on enemy activity and asking if additional warnings or instructions were needed for the return leg. The reply, when it came, was brief, with no mention of recent sinkings, no alerts for submarines on the route, only a reminder to maintain speed and follow standing orders. The language was formal, almost indifferent. No extra escort would be provided. The ship was not required to zigzag unless the captain deemed it necessary, and no new intelligence was forwarded. On the bridge, the officers compared the message to rumors circulating among the crew about Japanese submarines spotted in the area. The silence from command left them uneasy. The last official intelligence about submarine activity in the region, news of the USS Underhill's loss, never reached the Indianapolis. The only guidance was to trust the ship's speed and the discretion of the captain. There was no expectation of regular check-ins or arrival confirmation. The movement reporting system, standard for most Navy vessels, had been suspended for this mission. Secrecy wrapped the orders, and it changed everything about how the voyage was managed. The mood among the officers grew tense. With no clear answers from command, McVay weighed the risks alone. The responsibility for the ship's safety rested entirely on his shoulders. The men on deck sensed the uncertainty, reading it in the tight conversations among the watch officers and the careful way McVay studied the horizon each night. The Indianapolis pressed on, surrounded by open water and unanswered questions. Its fate was left to chance and the thin comfort of vague assurances from far-off command. A little after midnight, the calm of the Philippine Sea was broken. From beneath the waves, the Japanese submarine Y-58 unleashed a spread of torpedoes, closing the distance in silence. The first hit slammed into the Indianapolis forward of midship, the explosion tearing open the bow and sending a shockwave through the ship and those aboard. A second torpedo struck moments later beneath the bridge on the starboard side. The impact tore into fuel tanks and power lines, setting off a chain of explosions that raced along the length of the ship. In an instant, the lights flickered and died. Alarms failed. Radios cut out. Darkness swallowed the decks, leaving only the glow of burning oil and the distant thunder of rupturing bulkheads. Men were jolted from their bunks, thrown hard against bulkheads or pitched onto the tilting deck. In engineering, gauges spun wildly as steam hissed from broken pipes. Above, the bridge crew scrambled to make sense of the chaos, but the ship's command systems were gone. Water poured into open breaches in the hull, flooding compartments in seconds. The list grew sharper. Some sailors, still dazed, tried to reach their stations, but stairwells had already filled with water. Others ran for the main deck, dodging flames and choking smoke. The twin explosions crippled the Indianapolis in less than a minute. Power was lost. Communications were cut. The engines, once pushed to their limits for speed, fell silent as seawater rushed into the boiler rooms. Orders shouted in the dark were drowned by the roar of escaping air and the groan of twisting metal. Above the din, the reality set in. The ship was dying fast, and every second counted. Survival meant abandoning ship now. As the bow dipped lower and the stern began to rise, crewmen scrambled for life jackets, life rafts, anything that would float. In the confusion, discipline frayed. Some men leapt into the blackness. Others hesitated at the rails, unable to see what waited below. The Indianapolis, severely damaged, slid beneath the surface, and for hundreds of sailors, the fight for life had only just begun. 12 minutes. That is all the time the crew of the Indianapolis had from the first torpedo strike to the moment the ship vanished beneath the waves. In the darkness, everything happened at once. The bow, torn open, filled with water so quickly that compartments forward of the bridge were lost in seconds. Bulkheads buckled. The second blast, deeper amidships, sent flames and choking smoke through passageways. Power failed. The lights went out, leaving only the flicker of burning oil and the echo of alarms that never finished sounding. Men scrambled from their bunks, many barefoot, some still dazed from sleep. Those below deck found ladders already slick with oil and seawater. Hatches jammed or warped from the force of the explosions. In engineering, sailors tried desperately to slow the flooding, but water poured in too fast. The boilers hissed, then went silent as the engine rooms filled. The ship's list grew steeper by the minute, tilting decks at impossible angles. Orders shouted in the dark were swallowed by the roar of escaping steam and the groan of twisting metal. There was no time for an organized abandoned ship. Life rafts jammed in their cradles. Some men managed to throw out a handful of floater nets, but most had only their life jackets, if they could find them. Others jumped blindly, driven by heat and smoke, not knowing what waited below. In the chaos, discipline broke down. Some officers tried to rally their men at muster stations, but the ship was already breaking apart. The stern rose as the bow disappeared, and the Indianapolis began her final plunge. Within those 12 minutes, more than 1,000 men were forced into the open sea. Many never escaped the ship at all, trapped by flooding or fire. For those who did, the world shrank to a patch of black water. The sounds of men calling out, and the sudden, absolute silence as the Indianapolis slipped beneath the surface, leaving nothing but debris and oil in her wake. Salt water clung to every inch of exposed skin, stinging where the sun had already done its worst. The first hours in the open Pacific brought a heat so fierce it blistered shoulders and faces, peeling away the last protection the men had. Life jackets rubbed raw patches on necks and underarms, the fabric soaked not just in water, but in sweat and oil. There was no shade, no relief, only the relentless glare bouncing off the waves. Thirst set in quickly. Canteens that had survived the scramble from the sinking ship emptied within the first day. Some men tried to wet their lips with the ocean, but the salt only made things worse. Lips cracked, tongues swelled, and throats burned. Medical officers among the survivors warned against drinking seawater, knowing it would bring on confusion and, eventually, death. Still, desperation pushed some to take the risk. Dehydration worked its way through the group in stages. At first it was just a dry mouth and a pounding headache. By the second day, speech slurred and tempers frayed. Men grew too weak to hold on to debris, their hands slipping from the ropes as cramps set in. Hallucinations became common. A ship on the horizon, rain clouds that never arrived, the imagined taste of fresh water. The sun never let up. Each afternoon the heat built until it was hard to breathe. Skin blistered and split, turning white with salt crystals, then red and raw. The oil slick from the ship coated faces and arms, trapping the heat and making burns even worse. Some tried to shield themselves with scraps of clothing or debris, but nothing could block the sun for long. As the days dragged on, the crew's strength faded. Voices grew quieter. Some men slipped away in silence, too exhausted to call out. For those still conscious, the hope of rescue began to feel as distant as the horizon itself. The oil from the Indianapolis spread across the water in a thick, stinging film. Survivors found themselves coated head to toe, the black slick clinging to skin and clothing, burning eyes and throats with every breath. The fumes drifted low, making some men nauseous, others dizzy or confused. Every movement stirred the oil, and soon even the taste of it settled on their tongues. Some tried to wash their faces with salt water, but the oil just smeared deeper into pores. At first, the men clung together. Groups formed around officers, shipmates, or anyone with a scrap of authority. But as the hours passed, unity began to fray. Arguments flared over pieces of floating debris or access to the few remaining life rafts. Some men, desperate for relief, drifted away from the group, convinced that rescue was just over the next wave. Others grew suspicious, blaming shipmates for imagined slights or hoarded supplies. The heat and the oil made it hard to think clearly. Old friendships faded as survival instincts took over. The psychological strain was as corrosive as the oil itself. Men who had once trusted each other now eyed their neighbors with suspicion or indifference. Some fell silent, retreating inward. Others lashed out, their nerves stretched to the breaking point. The larger groups splintered into smaller clusters, each drifting on its own. In the chaos, discipline and order, the backbone of Navy life, collapsed. What remained was a fragile hope that someone, somewhere, would notice their absence before it was too late. By the third day, the oil had seeped into every wound, every thought. The men floated in isolation, cut off not just from help, but from each other. The ocean, once a place of shared purpose, became a field of strangers, each man alone with his pain, his fear, and the slow erosion of hope. Shadows moved beneath the survivors long before most realized what was happening. At first, fins cut quietly through the slick, circling the scattered groups. The men tried to keep together, clinging to ropes, debris, anything that floated. Every so often someone drifted too far from the cluster. Then a scream would cut the silence, piercing and final. Edgar Harrell later recalled that at daylight they saw fins. They formed a circle and tried to keep everyone in. Some men strayed off. You would hear a piercing scream, and then see the man go under. The sharks came in waves, drawn by movement, blood, and the chaos in the water. Sometimes they bumped legs, testing. Other times they attacked without warning. Survivors learned not to dangle their feet, not to splash. The ocean, already a place of suffering, became a hunting ground. Men watched the water with wide, sleepless eyes, knowing that the next loss could be anyone. Harrell's memory is echoed in every account. The same sudden sight of fins, and then a person missing. The terror of those days has echoed far beyond the survivors. Decades later, the story of the Indianapolis inspired the most famous shark scene in the movie Jaws. In Jaws, a grizzled fisherman tells the tale of men dragged under, one after another, never knowing when it would be their turn. That pop culture moment grew from real, unrelenting hours where the fear was not a single monster, but the endless, hungry silence below. For the men adrift, hope faded with every attack. The water was no longer just a place of thirst and exhaustion, but a place where danger could come without warning. The worst part was not only the sharks. It was the knowledge that no one was coming, and every hour brought new losses, each one witnessed and remembered. Duty stations at Guam, Leyte, and Okinawa each logged the Indianapolis distress call in the early hours of July 30, 1945. Radio operators on all three islands recorded the SOS, short bursts of static, then the urgent call sign, then silence. The logbooks show the times: 15 minutes past midnight, 25 minutes past midnight, and 35 minutes past midnight. At Guam, the message reached the radio room, but the duty officer, Lieutenant Commander William J. Ward, was found asleep at his desk, reportedly under the influence. No follow-up was made. In Leyte, radioman Robert E. Smith entered the call into the station ledger. His superior, Lieutenant Stuart B. Gibson, dismissed it as a likely error. The ship, he reasoned, should have been days away from trouble. No search was ordered. At Okinawa, the message was treated as a possible Japanese deception. Lieutenant Commander Robert E. Smith, fearing a trap, instructed his team to ignore it. Each entry in the communications logs was initialed, time-stamped, and filed away. No alarm was raised. The Navy Movement Report System, designed to track every ship's progress, depended on timely departure and arrival notices. Indianapolis was marked as departed from Guam. No arrival report came from Leyte. Port directors in Tacloban noted the ship's absence on July 31st and August 1st. Each day the log grew more uncertain. First, a simple note, USS Indianapolis not arrived. The next day, still overdue. No action followed. The ship was quietly removed from the arrival board, its fate unsaid. Administrative confusion, missed protocols, and outright neglect combined to erase the Indianapolis from the Navy's daily awareness. 3 distress calls were received, 3 stations logged them, and 3 officers failed to respond. No search planes launched, no destroyers were sent. The silence that followed was not just the result of war, it was the product of a system that, in those crucial days, failed at every level. On the morning of August 2, 1945, a patrol seaplane from the Navy's VPB-152 squadron flew a routine anti-submarine sweep over the Philippine Sea. Lieutenant Wilbur Gwynn, scanning the water below, caught a flash of sunlight on an oil slick. He banked for a closer look and saw hundreds of men floating in scattered groups, waving frantically. Gwynn's crew dropped life rafts and radioed their position, triggering a scramble among nearby ships and aircraft. Within hours, rescue operations began pulling survivors from the water. News of the disaster raced up the chain of command. The first question from Navy headquarters was not about the men's condition. It was about how the ship had gone missing without notice. As survivors were lifted aboard rescue vessels, medical officers recorded names and injuries. Many were unrecognizable, faces sunburned, and bodies weakened by days in the sun. Captain McVay, hauled from the ocean after nearly 5 days, was barely conscious. He was given a blanket and a cup of water before being separated from his men. The first words he heard from a Navy official were not words of comfort, but a demand for an immediate statement. Legal officers arrived with clipboards, pressing for details about the ship's course, speed, and whether zigzag orders had been followed. The tone was formal, urgent, and cold. Within 24 hours, McVay was summoned to meet with senior officers. He was still in hospital pajamas, his hands shaking from dehydration and shock. The questions came rapid fire. Why had he not zigzagged? Did he ignore warnings? Why was there no escort? The Navy's legal team began assembling a case before the full rescue was even complete. Reports were drafted for Washington. Each line focused on procedure, not on the ordeal the men had survived. The priority became clear: find a reason, find a responsible party, and close the file. For McVay, the rescue was not a return to safety, but the start of a new ordeal, one where the burden of blame was waiting on shore. Inside a paneled Navy courtroom, Captain Charles McVay sat at the defendant's table, his uniform pressed, but his hands trembling. The charge was clear: failure to zigzag. Navy prosecutors argued that this single decision had doomed the Indianapolis and her crew. They presented charts, navigation logs, and testimony from surviving officers. The prosecution's questions circled back to one point. Why had McVay not ordered a constant zigzag pattern, the standard evasive maneuver against submarines? Each answer was met with more skepticism, as if the outcome had already been decided. Then, in a move that startled even seasoned observers, the Navy called a witness from across the world. Commander Mochitsura Hashimoto, captain of the Japanese submarine I-58, entered the courtroom. He stood before the American officers and answered through a translator. When asked directly, Hashimoto stated that zigzagging would not have kept the Indianapolis safe. His submarine had tracked the ship by sight, not by sonar, and the spread of torpedoes would have struck regardless of McVay's maneuvers. It was a rare moment, a wartime enemy defending the man on trial. Hashimoto's words were clear. The outcome, he insisted, would have been the same. The court transcript recorded every exchange. Still, the prosecution pressed on, determined to fix responsibility. The legal proceedings moved quickly. McVay was convicted of hazarding his ship by failing to zigzag, even as Hashimoto's testimony lingered in the air. The verdict left McVay's career in ruins. He was promoted in rank but stripped of command, his reputation permanently scarred. The Navy closed its case, but for those who listened closely, the contradictions were impossible to ignore. Even now, accountability in moments of crisis too often gives way to convenient blame. The exoneration of McVay came decades too late. A reminder that truth can be buried by silence, but injustice leaves scars that last generations. As new headlines test our willingness to question official stories, the lesson remains: every cost of secrecy is paid by real people. Justice delayed is not just denied, it is inherited. Share your thoughts on McVay's legacy below.